the ocean is a perfect hiding place. Not because it's mystical, because it's loud. If you've never listened to the sea through a ship's sensors, you don't realize how crowded it is. The constant shove of waves, the grind of distant storms, the crackle of underwater life, the metallic whisper of propellers from vessels you'll never see. Even the sea floor contributes its own slow, patient noise. And inside that noise, a contact can appear like a thought that doesn't belong to you. A mark on a screen, a faint return, a shape that doesn't resolve. It's there for a second, then it's gone. You blink, and your mind does what minds always do. It tries to make the unknown familiar. A whale, a current, a sensor glitch, a friendly sub. Anything, as long as it's something. Because the alternative is admitting the simplest, most uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, the Navy watches the ocean and cannot explain what it's seeing. And when that happens, the story doesn't always reach the surface. There's a term that gets tossed around online like a coin. USO. Unidentified Submerged Object. The underwater cousin of the more famous UFO, except here, in the deep. You don't get clean video. You don't get dramatic silhouettes against the sky. You get signatures, anomalies, brief, haunting tracks that vanish into a black environment where pressure crushes steel and light dies a few 100 feet down. So this story isn't about certainty. It's about pattern. It's about how often the same kinds of unknowns show up around naval activity. It's about why so many accounts, quietly, reluctantly, suggest that something is moving beneath the sea in ways we don't fully understand. And it's about the strangest part of all. The Navy doesn't talk about these things the way the internet does. It doesn't shout aliens. It doesn't need to, because from the Navy's perspective, the question isn't where something comes from. The question is what it can do. Start here. Picture a control room lit in dim reds and greens, the kind of lighting that keeps your eyes adjusted while the ship moves through darkness. A watch team working in practiced silence. A sonar operator seated with headphones on, one hand hovering near a control, face angled toward a screen that looks like a simple display until you understand how much it's carrying. A line appears. Not loud, not dramatic. A soft track at a depth that shouldn't be interesting. Then, without warning, the track accelerates. Not gradually. Not like a creature swimming. Not like a vessel building speed. It just changes. The contact shifts position faster than you'd expect from anything natural, and faster than you'd expect from anything mechanical that has to fight water resistance. The operator calls it out. The watch officer leans in. Somebody runs the standard checks. Is it our own noise? Is it a layer effect? Is it a biologic? Is it a school of fish scattering? Is it a friendly platform? And then the most important question, the one every sailor recognizes even if they've never seen combat. Is it a threat? This is where the myth begins, because the public imagination wants underwater unknowns to be a single thing. A hidden civilization. Alien bases, a secret technology, a monster. But the truth is messier, and that mess is where the real suspense lives. Underwater unknowns are a basket. Sometimes they're misidentifications. Sometimes they're environmental phenomena. Sometimes they're classified human technology. And sometimes, rarely but persistently, there are reports that do not resolve into any of the above. Not neatly, not comfortably. You don't have to believe in extraterrestrials to take this seriously. You just have to accept two facts about the ocean. First, we have mapped more of the moon with clarity than we have mapped the deep sea floor at high resolution. Second, the ocean can hide almost anything. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough for a blip to become a story. Long enough for a story to become a rumor. Long enough for a rumor to become a category of memory that sailors pass to each other in the soft hours of the night. And those stories exist, not always on the record, but in the spaces sailors occupy when they can speak like humans again, when the shift ends, when the coffee is weak, when someone says quietly, "You ever see something out there you couldn't explain?" And the other person pauses a little too long before answering. I started collecting these accounts the way you start collecting any difficult truth, not by asking for the extraordinary, by asking for the ordinary. What does a normal contact look like? What does a normal false alarm feel like? What does a normal day on watch sound like? And then, once you understand the baseline, you can hear the changes, the moments when the voice shifts. When the speaker stops joking, when the details become precise. That's when you know you're getting close to something that left a mark. One former sonar tech told me he could still hear it. Not hear as in a sound you'd recognize, hear as in a pattern, a return that didn't behave like a whale, a track that didn't behave like a ship, a contact that seemed to anticipate the ship's movement, appearing ahead of the bow as if it had a map of the future. He didn't tell the story like a man selling a mystery. He told it like a man trying to justify a memory to himself. Because in the Navy, being wrong isn't merely embarrassing. It's operationally expensive. It wastes time. It burns resources. It turns training into confusion. So sailors learn to distrust their own sense of drama. They learn to understate. And that's why, when a sailor describes something they can't explain without leaning into spectacle, it carries a different weight. But before we go into the best-known cases, you need the ocean's trick. The trick is layers, temperature layers, salinity layers, pressure layers. A sonar ping doesn't travel in a straight, honest line like a flashlight beam. It bends, it refracts, it rides layers like a sound wave skimming a ceiling. That's why the Navy spends so much effort modeling the environment. Because if you don't know what the ocean is doing, you don't know what your sensors are doing. And if you don't know what your sensors are doing, you don't know what's out there. Or worse, you think you do. This is important because it explains a lot of unknowns. A layer can create a ghost contact. A biological swarm can look like something mechanical. A distant ship can appear close, and a close object can appear far. The ocean is a liar, not maliciously, mechanically. So any honest story about USOs has to begin with humility. That humility is exactly what makes certain reports so strange. Because the people who report them often describe the same starting point. We ran through the normal explanations. We checked the equipment, we checked the environment, we checked the logs, and the contact still didn't fit. If you want to understand why the Navy doesn't shout about USOs, you have to understand how the Navy thinks. A ship is a moving piece of national power. A submarine is a national secret. Even the patterns of training, the locations, the frequencies, those can be sensitive. So when something weird appears on sensors, there is a natural gravitational pull toward silence. Not because of conspiracy, because of habit, because of security culture. Because people don't get rewarded for turning odd contacts into public narratives. They get rewarded for solving the problem and moving on. And if they can't solve it? The safest thing is often to file it away. But the ocean keeps offering these moments, and over decades, enough moments become a shape. Let's talk about that shape. Not as a single monster, as a pattern of encounters, some mundane, some unresolved, that cluster around one truth. The sea is an environment where unknowns thrive. The first category is the kind nobody likes to admit. Misidentification. Because misidentification feels like weakness. But misidentification is often the honest beginning of any investigation. In the undersea world, biology is the master of disguise. Whales can travel fast, dolphins can cluster, large fish can reflect sound, and sometimes a group of creatures moving together can mimic the signature of a single object. Then there are internal waves, giant underwater ripples that move along density layers. They can create patterns that sonar interprets as movement. They can shift returns in ways that look like a target changing course. Even the seafloor can fool you. A steep slope or canyon can throw back weird echoes. Sometimes the unknown is a reminder that the ocean is complex, and our tools are imperfect translations of that complexity. The second category is more sensitive. Human technology, because the ocean is also a chessboard. If you are the Navy, you operate in a world where other nations build submarines designed to be quiet, nimble, and difficult to track. They deploy unmanned underwater vehicles, they test novel propulsion, they experiment with sensors, they probe training ranges, and sometimes they do it in ways that look impossible to people who aren't aware of what exists behind classified walls. It's not exciting to say that some USO might be a foreign drone, but it is deeply consequential. Because a foreign drone at the wrong time and place is not a myth. It's an intelligence breach. The third category is the one that creates the myth, the truly unresolved. Contacts reported as moving at extreme speed, contacts reported as stationary at depths where nothing should hover. Contacts reported as appearing and disappearing without transition, contacts reported as behaving as if they are aware of observation. This is where the term USO becomes a magnet, because the human brain hates an unresolved file. It wants closure. And the internet is an engine for closure making. It will supply an answer if you don't have one. But the Navy is not the internet. The Navy is forced to live with unanswered questions. And that, paradoxically, makes the unanswered questions more interesting. Because it means they survived scrutiny. They survived skepticism. They survived the basic filters that eliminate 90% of weird stories. Now, how far back does this pattern go? Longer than most people think. During World War II, sailors on both sides reported strange lights over the ocean. Most of those accounts belong to the sky, what people later called Foo Fighters. But there are also older maritime stories that describe luminous objects moving over water, diving in and out, or pacing ships at night. Some are folklore. Some are misinterpreted natural phenomena like bioluminescence or atmospheric effects, and some are the kind of accounts that don't fit neatly. A sailor on a night watch sees a light skimming the water, bright and steady, then plunging into the sea without a splash. Was it a meteor, a flare, a reflection, a misjudged distance? Sometimes yes. Often we simply don't know. But the modern USO story, the Navy story, really begins in the Cold War, because the Cold War turned the ocean into a surveillance field, not just with ships and subs, with microphones, with arrays. With networks designed to hear what the eye can't see. One of the most consequential tools in that era was underwater listening. Fixed acoustic systems designed to detect submarine noise over long distances. Once you build a system like that, you start collecting a kind of knowledge that doesn't exist in civilian life. You start hearing the ocean as a map. And occasionally you hear things that don't match your library. Unknown signatures, unknown patterns. A retired acoustic analyst once described it like this. Most of the time, the ocean is a symphony you learn by heart. Then one day a new instrument plays a note you've never heard, and you can't tell if it's an instrument at all. That's the psychological core of USO encounters. It's not the moment of fear. It's the moment your expertise becomes insufficient. Now imagine you're operating a submarine. You live inside a metal cylinder. You move blind. Your survival depends on being the quietest thing in a vast hostile environment. If a contact appears near you and behaves unpredictably, your body doesn't care whether it's a whale or a machine. Your body cares that you don't understand it. Because misunderstanding is how submarines die. There are stories from submariners, often told without dates, without names, about contacts that seemed to approach too quickly. A contact that went from distant to close without the gradual buildup you expect. A contact that crossed directly over the submarine. A contact that stayed with them for minutes, then vanished. If you're skeptical, good. You should be. Submariners are trained to interpret faint signals under stress. Stress can distort perception. In the undersea world, tiny errors become big stories. But the reason these accounts persist isn't because they're dramatic. It's because they're consistent in the kind of unease they describe. The feeling that something is not following the rules of what should be possible down there. Let me give you a scene that captures the flavor, without pretending it's a courtroom transcript. A submarine is transiting in deep water during a training period. Sonar reports a faint contact. At first it looks like biologics, maybe whales. The track is inconsistent. Then the contact straightens. It begins to move with a clean line, a steadiness that feels engineered. The watch team changes posture. The officer asks for classification. The sonar tech hesitates. Because classification is what you do when you know, and this is what you do when you don't. Unknown, he finally says. The captain orders a slight course change, and the contact mirrors it. Not perfectly, not like a dumb echo, like a thing reacting. Then it accelerates. Not with the gradual increase in noise you'd expect from a propeller. It just appears farther ahead on the next update, as if it moved in a way the system can't render smoothly. The captain is quiet for a long beat. Then he orders the contact logged, not as alien, as unidentified. Because in the Navy, language is how you stay sane. Here's the part that matters. Even if that scene has a mundane explanation, layering, biologics, sensor artifacts, the fact that it could occur at all is revealing, because it shows you the boundary of our certainty. The ocean is an environment where we routinely operate at the edge of interpretation, and at the edge, the unknown is always waiting. But USO stories didn't become a public obsession because of anonymous submarine accounts. They became an obsession because of something else, a phenomenon that seems to break our mental categories. Transmedium behavior, objects reported in the sky that appear to enter the ocean, or objects in the water that appear to leave it. That bridge, air to sea, is where the imagination ignites, because it suggests an object that isn't limited by the barriers we assume are real. If you've followed modern UAP discussions, you've probably heard about encounters near Navy training areas, pilots reporting objects behaving oddly, radar anomalies, videos released or acknowledged as genuine recordings of unknown objects. That story is complicated. It's full of competing interpretations. But one detail appears again and again in some accounts. The ocean. Why the ocean? Because training ranges are often over water, because ships are there, because sensors are there, because it's a controlled environment where you can test systems without civilians watching, and because the sea offers a convenient place for anything that wants to remain unseen. This is where the narrative seed becomes important. The Navy doesn't have to believe in non-human intelligence to take unknowns seriously. It only has to take seriously the possibility that someone has a capability advantage. Faster, quieter, more agile. more aware. And in modern military planning, capability advantage is not a curiosity, it's a warning. So let's shift into one of the better-known modern clusters, because it carries the ocean in its shadow, not as a stage, as a hiding place. In the early 2000s, Navy groups operating near training areas reported a pattern of strange radar returns and visual sightings. Different witnesses, different sensors, different days, but a repeating theme. Objects that didn't behave like normal aircraft, accounts of sudden acceleration, accounts of hovering, accounts of vanishing, and in some narratives, accounts of objects moving toward the sea. Here's the thing. Even if you treat these accounts with maximum skepticism, they matter because they occurred in environments dense with instrumentation, multiple sensors, multiple observers. Professionals trained to interpret what they see. That doesn't guarantee the extraordinary, but it does make pure dismissal harder. And when you connect that to underwater unknowns, you get a haunting possibility. What if some of these air anomalies are not purely air phenomena? What if the ocean is part of the picture? Not as a coincidence, as a route, as a base, as a boundary we don't control. Now, before your mind runs off into alien cities, pause. Because there's a very human explanation for why the ocean would be connected. The Navy tests things. The Navy's adversaries test things. The ocean is a place where those tests can be hidden. A transmedium object could be a drone moving between environments. A radar anomaly could be a sensor artifact. A sighting could be misperception. This story has to hold all of that at once, because if you pick one explanation too early, you stop investigating, and the only honest posture in the face of an unknown is sustained curiosity. That said, there is a reason USO stories persist in the Navy's oral culture. It's not because sailors are gullible. It's because sailors are surrounded by mysteries that do not get resolved in the moment. And sometimes, they never get resolved at all. Consider what it means to operate over deep ocean. Beneath you is an environment we cannot access casually. A few thousand feet down, the pressure is enough to crush a vehicle that isn't designed for it. At tens of thousands of feet, into trenches, it becomes a domain where only specialized deep-sea submersibles can survive. So if something is happening at depth, the simple fact of depth makes it hard to verify, hard to chase, hard to photograph, hard to explain. Hard, in other words, to close. And that's why the deepest claims, the ones that say, "We found something at impossible depth," are the most seductive. Because the ocean is the one place on Earth where the phrase, "we can't go there easily," is still true. Even in the era of satellites, even in the era of drones, even in the era of global surveillance, there are places in the sea that are simply beyond routine reach. But the Navy does go farther than most. It deploys sensors, it maps, it monitors, it listens. And every once in a while, it hears something it can't name. One of the most credible flavors of USO story is not visual, it's acoustic. The report of an underwater sound that doesn't match known sources. Some are natural, icequakes, earthquakes, volcanic activity. Some are human, ships, subs, industrial noise. And some remain debated. The point isn't that every mysterious sound is an alien engine. The point is that the ocean produces signals we still argue about. And if nature can surprise us that often, how sure are we that human activity accounts for everything? There is also a reason the Navy's unknowns cluster around certain places: training ranges, strategic choke points, areas near undersea infrastructure, deep-water corridors. Not because those places are haunted, because that's where sensors are, that's where ships are, that's where people are watching. A phenomenon that occurs in a place without sensors never becomes a report. It just becomes ocean. This is one of the most overlooked truths in USO discussions. We don't measure reality evenly. We measure it where we look. So if unknowns appear where the Navy trains, one explanation is simple. That's where the Navy can detect them. But detection is not explanation, and that's the core tension. Let me put a sharper question on the table. If a foreign adversary had a new underwater capability, silent propulsion, extreme speed, novel materials, where would it test it? It would test it in deep water. It would test it near its own coastline. And it would test it, if bold, near your training areas. Not to start a war, to gather intelligence, to probe reactions, to watch how you respond. Now imagine you're a Navy watchstander, and you see a contact that moves in a way you don't recognize. Your brain does not jump to alien. Your brain jumps to capability gap. And that is the Navy's version of fear, not cosmic terror, operational disadvantage. So when you hear that Navy personnel have reported unknowns, don't picture campfire stories. Picture a problem list, anomalies that refuse to be categorized, anomalies that might be nothing, anomalies that might be something, and anomalies that, in the worst case, might be someone else's tool. This is also why the Navy's relationship with these reports has changed over time. Not overnight, but noticeably. In recent years, there has been a push, publicly acknowledged in various ways, for pilots and sailors to report unidentified phenomena without stigma, because stigma is an operational problem. If people don't report anomalies, the system loses data. And if the system loses data, it loses the ability to understand threats. That shift toward collecting more reports creates a new effect. You start seeing the unknown more often, not necessarily because it's happening more, because you're documenting it more. And that can feel like an increase. It can fuel mythology, but it can also be the first step toward clarity. And that leads us to the most provocative thread in the modern USO conversation. The moments when unknown objects are reported to interact with the sea in ways that seem deliberate, not drifting, not crashing, entering the water as if the water is not an obstacle, leaving the water as if the boundary between sea and sky is negotiable. There are publicly discussed incidents involving Navy systems where objects were observed over water and, in some narratives, appeared to go into the ocean. In some cases, the details are debated. Videos are ambiguous. Radar data is not public. Witness memories vary, but the theme persists. And themes are the early stage of understanding, not proof, but a reason to keep looking. At this point, you might be thinking, okay, so what's the best case? What's the story that makes the hair on your arms rise? I'll tell you. It's not one perfect clip. It's the accumulation. It's how often the ocean is present as a hiding place, a destination, or a source. It's how many different kinds of Navy personnel, surface sailors, aviators, submariners, describe the same discomfort. That sometimes the ocean contains behavior that feels intelligent, not necessarily non-human. Intelligent as in responsive, as in intentional, as in aware. Awareness is the hinge. Because if the unknown is aware of you, it's not an accident. And if it's not an accident, then you have to ask a question that changes the entire story. Who is watching whom? In the next stretch of this story, we're going to walk through several of the most discussed modern cases where the sea shows up as more than scenery. We'll explore what is actually known publicly, what remains disputed, and why these incidents became magnets for the idea of USOs. And then we'll do something the internet rarely does. We'll sit with the boring explanations long enough to see where they fail. Because the most unsettling mysteries aren't the ones with flashy answers. They're the ones where every normal answer leaves a residue that doesn't wipe clean. So keep one image in your mind as we move forward. A calm ocean at dusk. A ship moving steadily. A pilot looking down at water that seems endless. And somewhere beneath that surface, whether it's biology, technology, or something we haven't named yet, an unknown presence that can appear for a moment, leave a trace, and vanish again. Not as a story, as a signal, because the sea doesn't care what you believe. It only cares what you can detect and what you can't. Now let's do what most USO discussions avoid. Let's step into the cases where the ocean isn't just a backdrop, where it becomes a character, a hiding place, a boundary, a door, and where, for a few seconds at a time, trained military professionals looked at that boundary and felt it blur. The first case isn't underwater, but it's the one that keeps dragging the sea into the conversation. Because in its most famous moment, the object wasn't high in the sky. It was low, near the surface, close enough that the pilot said they could see disturbance in the water below it, like something had been stirred up from beneath. On November 14, 2004, off the coast of Southern California, the USS Nimitz Carrier Strike Group was conducting training exercises. The cruiser USS Princeton, part of that group, had been tracking unusual radar returns for days. This is one of those details that matters. Not because radar is infallible, because the reports weren't a single flash. They were a pattern, repeated contacts, different times, different conditions. And then a decision. Send jets to look. 2 Navy pilots, Commander David Fravor and Lieutenant Commander Alex Dietrich, were among those tasked with investigating. When Fravor described what he saw later, he did not talk like a man chasing fame. He talked like a man describing something that still irritates his understanding. A white, oblong object, no wings, no visible rotor, moving in a way he couldn't reconcile with known aircraft, and crucially, hovering above a patch of ocean that looked disturbed. Foam. Churn. As if something large was just below the surface, pushing water up from underneath. Or as if the sea itself was reacting. Here's what makes that moment stick. If you saw an unknown object high in the sky, you could imagine a lot. A drone, a balloon, a classified aircraft, a trick of perspective. But hovering low over the ocean with an apparent disturbance beneath it? That adds a second layer. It suggests interaction, a relationship. A where did it come from? That points straight down. Now, skepticism matters here, because this case has been debated hard. Some researchers suggest sensor and perception errors could explain parts of it. Others argue the witness testimony, combined with radar reports, deserves more weight. And the video often associated with the incident, captured later, not necessarily by the same pilots, is itself a complicated artifact, a camera system, a sensor view, a narrow window into something distant. So no one should treat this as a clean cinematic proof. It isn't. But if you're trying to understand why the Navy's unknowns became a modern obsession, this is where the obsession gets its spine. Because this case contains the ingredients that make institutions uncomfortable. Multiple platforms reporting anomalies, professional observers, a training environment full of instrumentation, and an object that, in the retelling, seems to treat the air and the sea like they're part of the same space. That's the first seed. The ocean is not just where the Navy happens to be. It might be where the unknown goes. Now, fast forward, 15 years later. Different ship, different technology, same coastline, same quiet sense that the water is doing something you can't name. In July 2019, Navy personnel aboard the USS Omaha recorded infrared footage of a spherical object over the ocean at night. If you've seen the clip, You probably remember the moment everyone talks about. The object appears to stop. Then it eases down towards the water. And the people in the room react when it seems to meet the surface. Splash, someone says. That word is gasoline, because it implies the object entered the sea. A clean, transmedium transition, air to water, and then nothing. No target moving away, no follow-up visual, just the ocean swallowing the story. Here's the honest way to treat that footage. It's intriguing. It's also limited. Infrared cameras can lose contrast when an object's temperature is similar to the background. Over water at night, that matters. A target can appear to disappear into the ocean simply because the sensor stops distinguishing it. That is not a hand wave. It's physics. It's the difference between entered water and became indistinguishable. But notice what I just said. Even the skeptical explanation still admits the same core truth. The data is insufficient to close the case. And when data is insufficient, the ocean becomes the perfect collaborator, because it hides the second half of the story. If the Omaha footage is a Rorschach test, one person sees transmedium capability, another sees sensor limits, then the most important part isn't which person is right. It's the fact that a Navy crew experienced a moment where something was there and then wasn't. And that moment happened over water. Now let's go even deeper into the transmedium debate, because this is where USO mythology builds its strongest castles. In 2013, an incident near Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, was captured on infrared video by a U.S. Customs and Border Protection aircraft. Over the years, this footage became famous for one reason. It appears to show an object moving over land and then interacting with the ocean. In some analyses, the object seems to enter the water with little disturbance. Then later, it appears to split into two. It's one of the most cited transmedium cases. But here's the part that most people don't include when they share it like a mic drop. There is disagreement about what the footage actually shows. Some analysts argue the object's behavior is extraordinary. Others argue it can be explained by mundane factors, distance, speed estimation errors, sensor quirks, and the behavior of a target that may not be what it seems. And more recently, an official government analysis has argued that the object did not enter the water at all, that the apparent entry is caused by the sensor losing contrast against the ocean. Let that land. The same phenomenon that could explain the Omaha splash moment could also reshape older footage. Not because the government is automatically right, not because independent analysts are automatically wrong. Because the real enemy here is ambiguity. Infrared does not give you the world. It gives you a thermal interpretation of the world. And interpretation can deceive you if you treat it like direct sight. So what does that mean for USOs? It means the hardest part of the story is not finding footage. It's finding footage that closes the loop. Footage that shows a clear object in air, then a clear object underwater, tracked continuously with reliable telemetry. That is rare. And the ocean is why. The ocean breaks the chain. It swallows the target. It turns "I saw" into "maybe." But here's the twist. The twist isn't that the ocean makes it hard to prove aliens. The twist is that the ocean makes it hard to prove anything, including foreign technology, including environmental phenomena, including your own classified tests. So when people say, "The Navy must know what these are," the most honest response might be, sometimes the Navy knows what it isn't. And that's not the same as knowing what it is. Now we can finally bring USOs back to their proper place. Not as a single creature. As the undersea version of the same problem, uncertainty in a domain where uncertainty is dangerous. If you want to understand why underwater unknowns can be even more unsettling than aerial ones, consider the physics. In air, you have distance. In air, you have line of sight. In air, you have cameras and radar and visual tracking. Underwater, everything is mediated. Sound travels well, but it doesn't give you an image. Light dies quickly. Pressure limits your ability to chase. Even a simple confirmation becomes difficult. That is why the most credible USO stories often share the same pattern. Not, we saw an alien craft, we had a contact, we tracked it, we could not classify it, and it behaved oddly enough that the people who live in that world didn't shrug it off. So let's talk about what oddly actually means in the undersea domain, because this is where the internet tends to exaggerate, and where the Navy, if it speaks at all, tends to understate. Odd doesn't always mean high speed. Sometimes odd means too quiet, a contact that appears where you'd expect machinery to be louder, or a signature that doesn't match any library you've built over years of listening. Odd can mean depth. A track reported at a depth where certain known platforms don't routinely operate. Depth by itself isn't proof of anything. But depth plus behavior can raise eyebrows. Odd can mean persistence, a contact that stays in a region near sensitive activity without behaving like a natural animal. Odd can mean correlation, multiple sensors seeing something at the same time. Not identical, not perfect, but enough overlap that the anomaly survives the first round of skepticism. And odd can mean something that is hardest to measure, but easiest to feel. Awareness, a contact that appears to react, to mirror, to pace, to position itself as if it understands the geometry of your movement. Awareness is the seed that grows into mythology, because awareness implies intent, and intent implies actor, and actor implies origin. This is the moment where you might expect me to pivot into a grand reveal, an underwater base, an ancient civilization, an alien factory line beneath the trench. But the responsible thing to do is the opposite. It's to show you where those stories come from, and why they keep returning. They return because the ocean is one of the few environments where the phrase, "we can't check easily," remains true. We can't send a helicopter. We can't point a camera. We can't dispatch a patrol car. To truly verify an undersea anomaly, you need time, equipment, weather, mission priorities, and a willingness to spend money. And even then, the sea can still win. Now, layer in another factor. The Navy operates a mid-classification. If an anomaly occurs near a submarine operation, you don't publicize it. If it occurs near a training range, you don't necessarily publicize it. If the sensor systems involved are sensitive, you protect them. So even when the Navy investigates, the public often sees only the outer shell of the story. A rumor, a clip, a third-hand retelling. And in that informational vacuum, the internet does what the internet always does. It writes endings. That's why, for years, you heard whispers about objects entering the ocean long before you had official acknowledgement of any UAP videos. It's why you heard sailors describe swarms and unknowns without context. It's why a single word in a leaked conversation, splash, can become a cornerstone of a mythology. But here's the turning point I promised you. The moment that changes the interpretation of everything that came before. The turning point is this. If USOs are real in the sense that underwater unknowns exist, anomalies the Navy cannot immediately explain, then the biggest story is not aliens. The biggest story is the ocean itself as a strategic blind spot. Think about what that means. We've built a modern world that depends on undersea infrastructure, cables carrying communications, routes of commerce, military deterrents built on submarines moving silently. If there is any domain where small unknowns can become large threats, it's the sea. And if you accept that, then the Navy's interest in unknowns becomes less about wonder and more about vulnerability. That vulnerability has changed policy. In a public assessment released in 2021, the U.S. government noted that limited data and inconsistent reporting were major obstacles, and that a standardized Navy reporting mechanism did not exist until March 2019. Read that slowly. For decades, people saw things, but the system didn't always have a clean, stigma-free way to collect the information. That fact can produce two opposite reactions. 1. They've been hiding it. 2. They didn't even have a standardized mechanism. Both can be true in different ways, because sometimes hiding is an intentional cover-up, and sometimes hiding is what happens when a culture discourages speaking about anomalies. The result is the same: less data, more rumors, more unresolved files. Now we arrive at the core mystery. Not, are there aliens underwater? But what are we missing because we don't collect enough clean data in the places we can't easily see? This is where the USO story becomes, strangely, hopeful. Because the shift toward normalized reporting means a different future. More cases documented, more sensors correlated, more analysis, less mythology. Or, if the unknown truly has teeth, more clarity about the nature of the threat. But we need to confront a final complication. The complication is that the undersea domain is full of secrets that are not alien. If you are watching a training range and you see a Transmedium object, one explanation could be extraordinary. Another could be classified testing, an unmanned system, a sensor calibration exercise, a technology demonstration, a foreign platform probing you, or your own platform being tested without your knowledge. Yes, sometimes even within large organizations, compartments exist. People are kept out of the loop, not because of malice. Because secrecy is structural. So when sailors report an unknown, it may not be unknown to everyone. It may be unknown to them. And that is not an insult. That is how modern military systems operate. So what do we do with the unresolved remainder? The part that doesn't collapse into biology, the part that doesn't collapse into drones, the part that doesn't collapse into sensor artifacts. We do what the Navy does. We hold it open. We label it carefully. We resist premature certainty. And we keep gathering. Because certainty is the luxury of people who don't have to act. Now, let me give you one last image, one last story shape, that captures what this feels like for the people closest to it. A sailor standing outside on a ship's deck at night. The ocean is black glass. The horizon is a thin line. And somewhere far off, the sky is not empty. It's layered with faint lights. Stars, distant aircraft, maybe a satellite gliding. Nothing unusual. Then, near the waterline, a light appears. Not a navigation light, not a flare, just a glow that moves too steadily, too purposefully. It paces the ship for a minute. Then it seems to dip, down toward the surface. The sailor blinks. The light is gone. No splash, no sound. The ocean returns to being ordinary. The sailor goes back inside. He tells no one, or he tells one person. And the story becomes one more thread in the Navy's quiet tapestry of unknowns. Was that aliens? Maybe. Probably not. But here's the part that matters. If you're the Navy, you can't build strategy on probably not. You build strategy on capability, on detection, on understanding. And that is why the Navy's underwater unknowns are more than campfire stories. They are a reminder that the sea is still a domain where our knowledge is incomplete, where our tools are imperfect, where our adversaries can hide, where nature can surprise us, and where, occasionally, something can appear on a screen and force professionals to say the most unsettling word in any operational language. Unknown. If you came into this expecting a clean answer, I won't insult you with one. Because the honest ending of the USO story is not a revelation. It's a posture, a willingness to admit that the ocean contains things we misread, a willingness to improve the way we observe, a willingness to protect witnesses from ridicule so data doesn't die in silence, and a willingness to hold open the possibility that the world is bigger than our categories. Somewhere out there, beneath the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Arctic, beneath shipping lanes and training ranges and quiet trenches, there are movements we do not track continuously. Some are whales, some are currents, some are machines, some are nothing at all, and some may be the beginnings of a story we don't have language for yet. But the sea will not give you that story on your terms. It will give you fragments, a blip, a strange track, a clip with a shouted word, a moment of professional uncertainty. Then it will close again, as if nothing happened. That's the ocean's power. It doesn't need to lie. It only needs to keep most of itself hidden. And as long as we keep operating on its surface, listening into its depths, the Navy will keep encountering the same reality, sometimes mundane, sometimes unsettling, always unfinished. A contact appears. A watch team leans in. A report gets filed. And somewhere below, the water keeps its secrets.